The Role of Hadith in Ikhtilāf among Muslim Jurists. Chapter 2. Hadith, its acceptance and rejection. 1. The Acceptable Hadith. In this chapter, we will deal with the Acceptable Hadith and the Rejected Hadith. It will be noted the quality of acceptability is more general than the quality of Sahih in the Hadith. As-Suyuti has presented three main characteristics for an acceptable hadith. One is that the hadith which has been accepted by the scholars, even though it does not have a reliable chain, i.e. a chain of authorities. 2. It is renowned by the scholars of hadith without any disapproval. 3. It should be one that corresponds to a verse from the Quran or to a principle of Islamic law, and there should not be any liar in its isnad. It is said in Kashf al-Asrar that acceptability of a hadith does not mean believing it, and rejection does not mean denying it. For the acceptable is that which it must be practiced, and the rejected is that which we are not obliged to practice. Al-Bukhari therefore attempts to show that the Sahih Hadith, there are some which are rejected, such as the abrogated ones, or those that are objected to by more authoritative Hadith, and so on. They illustrate this by the Hadith of Mu'adh ibn Jabal, that the Prophet sent him as a judge to Yemen. He therefore asked him what he will use as a reference in his judgments, and he said, Quran. And if he did not find the answer, he would use the Sunnah, and if he failed to find the answer again, he would formulate his own opinion, as may be feasible. The Prophet accepted it and was delighted. This hadith is one of the proofs for the legality of qiyas, and it became famous for it, mentioned in every book of usul and hadith. In spite of this, the hadith is declared weak by a large majority of scholars because of a deficiency in its isnad, and the fact that part of its meaning is incorrect. As for those who declared it weak, there are many, but I mention Al-Bukhari, Ibn Hajar, Al-Tirmidhi, Al-Dhahabi and others. 10 of them are mentioned by Albani. The deficiency in this hadith is that one of its transmitters is unknown, as well as the fact that it is a mursal hadith. As for the incorrectness of its meaning, if one seeks God's judgment in a certain matter, he may not look for it only in the Quran, but in the Sunnah also, for it contains as legislation additional to the Quran, and there are many examples of this. Therefore, one must look in both sources at the same time, and must not differentiate between the two, for the Sunnah supplements the Quran and clarifies its general concepts. As well as characterizing its general concepts, as well as specifics, specifying its generalizations and qualifying it in absolute terms. But the Quran has precedence over the Sunnah because it is the word of God, while the Sunnah is not. But the meaning of the Hadith of Mu'adh in relation to the validity of ijtihad when a Quranic text or Hadith is lacking is of course correct. Therefore, I say that this Hadith cannot be used as an example of an acceptable Hadith. For the acceptable Hadith is that which can support an opinion with a good proof, while the rejected is one which does not provide sufficient proof. There has been some controversy among the scholars concerning the conditions of acceptability and rejection. I mentioned in chapter 1 that all the scholars accept the validity of the mutawatir hadith without any disagreement, but as for the ahad hadith is concerned, some accept it with certain conditions. This I shall deal with in this chapter, and there are others who added more conditions that I have already explained. The kinds of ahad hadith that have been accepted by the scholars are 4. That which is sahih on its own, that which is hasan on its own, that which is sahih due to another narration, and that which is hasan due to another narration. I shall deal with each kind of these hadiths in detail. The first one, the hadith which is sahih on its own. It is the one which contains the utmost characteristics for acceptability and is defined as a hadith that is musnad and whose isnad is connected to the transmission, adl dabit, on the authority of another, adl dabit, an accurate transmitter with an honourable record, until the end of the isnad, without being incorrect and deficient. Thus, the conditions for the Sahih Hadith are 5. A. Connection. By this we mean that each one of the narrators of the Hadith received it from the one right above him until it ends with the Prophet, who is the origin. What seems strange is Awam's view about the condition that Al-Bukhari stipulated that the two narrators should have met in order to make a hadith sahih, while Muslim, meaning the author of Sahih Muslim, was content with the proof that they were contemporaries. But this is not all true, because Bukhari had stipulated in his book As-Sahih that the two narrators should physically meet, and that is in order to get the highest ranks of connection for the hadith. Muslim, on the other hand, was contented with the proof that they were simply contemporaries. Therefore, the conclusion that Muhammad Awama reached is wrong, for he says, what Muslim declares as Sahih based on the concept that the two narrators should only be contemporaries is not considered Sahih absolutely by Al-Bukhari. The truth is that Bukhari does not consider such a hadith as Sahih, but he lays down more stringent conditions to include a hadith in his own book, i.e. the two narrators should not only be contemporaries, but they should have actually physically met one another. B. The unrightness or righteousness of the narrators. This is a quality that causes the bearer to be a devout, pious, to abstain from uncleanness, and to not violate the honour of mankind. C. Accuracy. The narrator must memorize the hadith and preserve it in his heart or write it down, and should be able to recite it when needed. D. Absence of shudūdh. Shudūdh is when a reliable report contradicts a more reliable reporter. The traditionists have details as to when the hadith is shadh and when it is not, and they have rules for this issue. E. Absence of defects. The absence of any defect in the hadith that may affect its soundness and reliability. In most cases, the defect is hidden and therefore unnoticeable. Thus, the hadith apparently looks reliable, but inherently may lack any condition of a Sahih Hadith. Ibn Salah says that this is the hadith which is declared Sahih without any disagreement amongst the traditionists. Many have contradicted these conditions. Some do not stipulate the connection of its Isnad, and thus accept the Mursal Hadith if it has followed the rest of the conditions. I shall deal with this when discussing the Mursal Hadith. Yet others add the condition that the hadith should not be narrated by a single narrator, but two or more. This condition is discussed by many scholars and is rejected. Al-Hakim says, the property of the Sahih Hadith is that it should be transmitted on the authority of the Prophet by a companion who is not ignorant, and then by two upright followers of the companions on his authority. It must then be circulated among the traditionists and be acceptable. Al-Mayaniji attributes this condition, the transmission of two, to Al-Bukhari and to Muslim in his book Ma Laysa Al-Muhaddith Jahiluhu, and the Ibn Athir accepts it. Even Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki believes that Bukhari and Muslim laid the condition of two narrators for a Sahih Hadith, though he himself rejects this doctrine as false, saying that the transmission of a single narrator fulfills the requirements of a Sahih Hadith. The statement of Ibn Arabi astonishes Ibn Hibban, for he claims that this was the opinion of the two Imams Bukhari and Muslim, and then he invalidates it. Ibn Hibban says, what is amazing is how he attributes that to the two Imams and then claims it's invalid. I wish I knew from where he had stipulated that. If it had been transmitted, he must show that, but this is his own conclusion, and he is mistaken. To those who claim that this condition was made by Bukhari and Muslim, Ibn Hajar responds by saying, this is the statement of the one who has not studied the two Sahihs thoroughly. For when one says there is no such hadith in the two books, one should not be mistaken. As-Suyuti says, the number of reporters is not a condition. He who stipulates two or more reporters is mistaken. Thus we know that the condition that there be two narrators for hadith is rejected by the scholars, and therefore its attribution to a Sahihain is not true. For the first hadith in Al-Bukhari's work is transmitted by a single narrator on the authority of another, and I have mentioned this in the first chapter. The Sahih Hadith is an authority without any contradiction if the above mentioned five conditions are fulfilled. Ibn Athir says, the traditionists and the trustworthy of fiqh and usul scholars have agreed that Sahih Hadith is an authority that must be pursued, regardless of whether its narrator is one, or whether there was another one with him, or that there were three or more narrators, or whether there was a mutawatir. Al-Qasimi says, the Sahih Hadith should be acceptable even if no one has employed it, and he supports this view by what Shafi had represented in his Risala, saying, a narration is considered valid from the time its authenticity is proven, even if none of the Imams has followed it. Shafi'i believes that a narration is dependent on its authenticity, even if it was not followed by any of the Imams, and therefore does not accept any of the conditions that the others have set for pursuing the Sahih Hadith. The Sahih Hadith vary in degree of authenticity and strength. The highest of the Sahih is that which Al-Bukhari and Muslim have agreed upon. Then comes that which is reported by Bukhari alone. Then that which is reported by Muslim alone. Then follows that which is reported according to the conditions of the both of them, followed by that which is according to the conditions of Al-Bukhari, followed by that which is according to the conditions of Muslim, and finally the Sahih which is narrated by others but not reported by either Bukhari or by Muslim. Other scholars believe that the strength of a hadith is based upon the consideration of its chain of reporters and not on the consideration of its existence in a certain book. An isnad cannot be judged as the most sound of all isnads in absolute terms, because the scholars judge an isnad with respect to the country from which it issues, or with respect to the specific companion to whom it is attributed. For example, it is said that the most sound isnad in Damascus is so-and-so on the authority of so-and-so, and the most sound isnad of Abu Hurairah is so-and-so on the authority of so-and-so. But Al-Ala'i mentions that the isnad of Ahmed ibn Hanbal on the authority of Shafi, on the authority of Malik, on the authority of Nafi', on the authority of Ibn Umar, is the best isnad in the world. And this isnad is non-existent except in one hadith mentioned in Musnad of Ahmed ibn Hanbal. So I conclude that it must be the most authentic hadith of all. Ahmed Shakir compiled the top isnads attributed to the companions which the scholars have presented, and he added more to them. But he did not mention the isnads which were attributed to the specific places and cities. These you will find in Manhaj al-Naqd. The preference amongst the hadith is useful when controversy arises concerning the preponderance of a hadith. That which is the most sound isnad has precedence over the others, and a hadith that Bukhari and Muslim agreed upon is one of the ways that preference is used by the scholars.